we have gone over the first few steps of inquiry. The first part, we unpack the question. So you need to know what the question is asking in order to be able to answer it. Second part is to do research on evidence that you think will help you explain that question. And the third part, the part that we're going to work on now, is how to use your evidence to answer the question. The difference between an inquiry question and a research question is that a research question, your research actually answers the question. What are the significant inventions of the Tang dynasty? You research, you find out those significant inventions, you find out why they're significant, and you have your answer to the research question. An inquiry question doesn't work that way. Because the inquiry question, the research that you do, then has to be explained in terms of the question. To demonstrate this, I created a question. Why do continuity and change have to balance each other for a society to progress? I'm not going to show the unpacking of the question because you guys know how to do that. We've done that already, and I demonstrated that with some different questions. But for this one, on this page, what you can see is the thought process that I went through in trying to answer this. So I started by brainstorming, okay, continuity is things continuing. Change is things, changing. So what I had to find were areas in both Africa and Asia where the continuing of something stayed the same so that something else could change. The first thing I thought of was China. Because in China, you had the Tang and the Song dynasties, and they lasted for at least 300 years each. So with both of those dynasties, you had the continuity of the dynasty, of how they were ruling the country. And because you had that continuity, things could change. The Tang dynasty and the Song dynasty are two in China where some of the major innovations, major inventions occurred. I had a lot more trouble when I was looking at Africa. So you can see some of the examples that I gave. I looked at Ghana with the idea that the control of the trade routes helped it flourish. But when I read both the blue and the brown textbook, I couldn't find a lot of examples of how it flourished. And then when I did some research outside of the textbooks, again, I was having a really hard time finding some specific examples of how it changed. I could see the continuity. I was having trouble with the change part. So then I looked at Mali, and I looked at Timbuktu in specifics, because I was able to find a little bit more information about it. Mali conquered Timbuktu, provided guidelines, provided a stable government, and provided protection, built the mosques, and brought people in. So when I looked at the textbooks, I was able to find some information for that, so I thought, okay, yes. Then I did my research. What I want to do with you now is show you how we then use that to answer the question. When I look at my examples, I want to make observations that are related to continuity and change, and I've articulated some of those to you. I noticed that with China, it was when the dynasties were steady for a period of time that the greatest inventions happened. And I hypothesize, looking at what I've seen, that is because people need to be secure. They need to have enough food. They need to have shelter. They need to be able to trust that they're safe in order for them to turn their attention to something else. And if I want a counterexample, when I look at the Yuan dynasty with the Mongols, they took over and they were in power for a period of time of about 100 years. I know that from my research. But they didn't treat people very well. They made it so that only Mongols could be in charge of the government. They increased taxes. They treated people harshly, and that caused people to rebel, which meant that they weren't focused on advancing science or advancing medicine or advancing whatever. They were focused on surviving the rebellions, paying their taxes. When I look at Africa and Timbuktu in particular, one of the things that I found in my research was that Mali controlled it for a while, and then someone else took it over, and then someone else took it over. And it was still prosperous. So it wasn't the change in government. That didn't seem to make a difference. What happened was in Timbuktu, when there was no longer protection from people raiding it, that's when it started to decline. I can see that the change in government is less important. It doesn't lead to a lack of progress. But the change in protection, this idea of safety, that still does. So what I've done here is I have started with my question. I made sure I understood what the question meant. I brainstormed examples of how I might answer that question, of evidence that might work to answer that question. I chose my evidence and I did my research in more detail. And then I went back to the question. And how does my evidence help me answer? What I'm learning, what I have learned from my research is it's not even just stability, because it's not the stability of the government, it's safety. When people have enough food, when they have shelter, when they're protected, when they feel safe, they turn their attention to other things. So I've answered my question now by using this evidence. My final step is to figure out, okay, I know what my answer is, how am I going to teach other people that? In my answer, I would go into more detail in China. What was it that was going on in these dynasties that was stable? What were the inventions that were significant? How were they invented? But I'm going to tie it back into this question. Only because in China, in Timbuktu, they had that stability, that continuity, were they able to come up with the changes, the innovations, the technology that they did. You're taking your research, you're going back to your question. How does your research answer that question? And then how are you going to present it? You need to be able to engage your audience, but also actually make sure that the information, not in terms of little factoids, but the actual information, the detailed information, is being shared with your audience. You have to be able to teach people. In this question, am teaching people about the Tang and Song dynasties, and I'm teaching people about Timbuktu, and I'm teaching people about the innovations, but I'm also teaching people about how, in order to be able to innovate, to do new things, you have to feel secure.